Pick it up yourself. The words landed harder than the sound of the ID hitting the marble floor. At 10:14 on a bright Tuesday morning inside one of the most prestigious banking branches in downtown Charlotte, North Carolina, every conversation seemed to pause for a second. The air conditioning hummed softly. The digital stock ticker above the investment desks continued to scroll. A coffee machine hissed somewhere in the private client area. Yet all eyes drifted toward the woman standing at teller window 3. Naomi Carter did not move. Her driver's license rested face up on the polished white floor between her and the counter. The photo stared back from the marble like evidence in a courtroom. Across from her stood Heather Collins, a bank teller with perfectly styled blonde hair, a pressed navy blazer, and the confidence of someone who believed she understood exactly who belonged in a place like this and who did not. Heather folded her arms and leaned back slightly. "If you want it, you can pick it up," she said. A few customers glanced away immediately. Others watched more carefully. The silence felt heavier than the building itself. Naomi remained calm. She wore dark jeans, simple loafers, and a charcoal sweater. No designer logos. No jewelry beyond a modest watch. Nothing about her appearance suggested headlines, boardrooms, or billion-dollar negotiations. That was exactly the point. She looked down at the ID for a moment, then back at Heather. Her expression did not change. Not even slightly. The teller seemed disappointed by the lack of reaction. "We need additional verification," Heather continued. "People walk in here claiming all sorts of things." Naomi rested one hand lightly on the counter. Her fingers were still. Her breathing remained steady. The marble floor reflected the morning sunlight streaming through 30-foot glass windows facing Tryon Street. Outside, traffic moved normally. Inside, something had shifted. An older man waiting near the investment offices lowered his newspaper. A young woman seated beside the loan department stopped typing on her phone. Nobody said anything, but everyone felt it. Heather glanced at her computer screen and then back at Naomi. "You heard me." The words came with a small smile. Not friendly, not professional. Certain. Naomi had encountered that smile before. It was the smile of assumption. The smile that decided a story before hearing it. The smile that looked at skin color, clothing, posture, and instantly believed it knew the ending. Yet Naomi did not bend down. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked at the ID lying between them. The bank suddenly felt smaller, tighter, like the walls themselves were listening. Behind the counter, another employee glanced toward Heather, then quickly looked away. No one intervened. No one questioned what had happened. Heather tapped her fingernail against the counter. "Are we going to continue this transaction or not?" Naomi slowly lifted her eyes. Calm, measured, unreadable. Somewhere deep inside the building, an elevator bell chimed. Somewhere far beyond the bank, decisions worth billions of dollars were waiting for a signature. But inside this branch, none of that mattered yet. What mattered was a single ID card on a marble floor and a teller who believed she had just put the right woman in her place. Naomi looked at Heather for another long second. Then she spoke for the first time. "Interesting choice," she said quietly. And suddenly the room felt charged. Heather expected an argument. She expected frustration, maybe embarrassment. What she got instead unsettled her. Naomi Carter simply stood there, calm as still water. The teller shifted her weight and looked back at her monitor as if searching for confirmation that her judgment was correct. Naomi could almost see the story Heather had already written in her mind. A black woman dressed casually. No assistant. No designer handbag. No visible signs of wealth. Therefore, not important. Therefore, suspicious. It was a familiar equation. Naomi had spent most of her life watching people solve it incorrectly. The branch occupied nearly 20,000 square feet in the heart of Charlotte's financial district. Floor-to-ceiling glass overlooked streams of morning commuters. Wealth advisors moved between offices carrying tablets and folders. Private bankers escorted clients through frosted doors into conference rooms. Everything about the building projected confidence and exclusivity. Naomi knew that image well, because her company had spent the last 8 months evaluating whether this institution would become a critical partner in a merger valued at $5.9 billion. Somewhere in New York, attorneys were reviewing final language. In Chicago, analysts were preparing integration reports. In Atlanta, executives were waiting for confirmation calls. Hundreds of careers and years of planning were moving toward a single decision. Yet none of those people knew that the woman holding that decision was standing quietly at window 3 while her identification card remained on the floor. Naomi had not arrived to impress anyone. In fact, she had done the opposite. No chauffeur, no executive team, no advance notice. She preferred seeing organizations exactly as they behaved when nobody important appeared to be watching. That habit had saved her company millions of dollars over the years. Culture revealed itself in ordinary moments. Character revealed itself when power seemed absent. Heather cleared her throat. "Ma'am, if you cannot provide proper verification, we may need to restrict the transaction." Naomi looked at her. "You already have my identification." Heather glanced toward the floor, but did not move. "That is your responsibility." The words drifted through the lobby like smoke. Several customers exchanged uncomfortable looks. Near the loan department, a young employee paused while organizing documents. She watched the interaction for a second longer than everyone else before returning her attention to her desk. Naomi noticed. She noticed everything. Years of leading negotiations had taught her that the smallest reactions often mattered most. A manager emerged from a hallway leading to the private banking offices. He was tall, silver-haired, and carried himself with practiced authority. Richard Monroe, branch manager. Heather immediately straightened. Relief crossed her face. Reinforcements had arrived. Richard approached the counter with a polite smile that never reached his eyes. "Is there a problem?" "Here," he asked. Heather answered before Naomi could speak. "Verification concerns." Richard nodded slowly. His gaze traveled over Naomi's clothing, her posture, her expression. He seemed to reach a conclusion within seconds. Naomi had seen that look too. The room remained bright and elegant, but something underneath had darkened. The bank still looked impressive. The people inside were beginning to reveal something else entirely. And somewhere hundreds of miles away, executives continued waiting for a signature that had suddenly become much less certain. Richard Monroe stopped beside Heather's station and folded his hands in front of him. The gesture looked professional. The expression behind it did not. His eyes moved from Naomi's face to the identification card still resting on the marble floor. For a brief second, he seemed to recognize how unusual the situation looked. Then the moment passed. "Good morning," he said. "I am Richard Monroe, branch manager. I understand there are some verification issues." Naomi met his gaze. "Your teller dropped my identification and refuses to pick it up." Richard glanced toward Heather. Heather offered a small shrug. "We have procedures," she said. Richard nodded as if that explained everything. "Ma'am, our employees are trained to follow security protocols." Naomi noticed the wording immediately. Not concern, not apology, justification. The difference mattered. Around them, the lobby continued operating, but fewer people were focused on their own business now. Conversations had become quieter. Phones lowered. Eyes lingered. People sensed that something was wrong even if they could not yet explain why. Richard turned his attention back to Naomi. "What type of transaction are you attempting today?" Naomi answered calmly. "A routine transaction." Heather let out a short laugh before she could stop herself. Richard shot her a look, but not one of correction. More like a warning to be discreet. Naomi saw that too. "A routine transaction," Richard repeated. "And what exactly qualifies as routine in this case?" His tone remained polite. The implication did not. Naomi rested her hand lightly on the counter. "Enough that your institution should know how to handle it." Richard's smile tightened. Heather tapped several keys on her keyboard and shook her head. "I'm still not comfortable with this profile." The word profile hung in the air. Several customers exchanged glances. A man waiting near the investment offices lowered his coffee cup. A woman seated by the mortgage department frowned openly. Richard leaned toward Heather's monitor. Whatever he saw appeared to confirm his assumptions. "We may need additional review," he said. "Until then, certain services may be restricted." Naomi remained motionless. That calmness seemed to frustrate them more than resistance would have. People expecting a confrontation often become uncomfortable when they receive composure instead. Across the lobby, the young employee Naomi had noticed earlier looked up again. Her name badge read Emily Dawson. She had been organizing account documents, but now her attention was fixed on Heather's screen. Something about the information displayed there appeared to catch her eye. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. Then she looked at Naomi, then back at the screen. A tiny crack appeared in the story Heather and Richard had created. Emily stood from her desk and took a cautious step toward the teller station. Richard noticed immediately. "Emily," he said sharply, "do you need something?" She hesitated. "I just thought I recognized." Richard cut her off before she could finish. "Return to your workstation." Emily stopped speaking, but uncertainty remained on her face. Naomi saw it. Heather saw it too. The teller quickly minimized a window on her monitor. Richard adjusted his tie and straightened his posture. The room felt increasingly tense. Not loud, not chaotic, just charged, like a storm gathering behind clear skies. Naomi looked once more at the identification card on the floor. Nobody had touched it. Nobody had corrected the situation. Instead, the branch manager and his teller seemed determined to prove they were right. What neither of them realized was that every additional minute they spent defending their assumptions was moving them closer to a mistake far larger than either could imagine. Emily Dawson tried to focus on the stack of client files in front of her, but her eyes kept returning to the teller station. Something was wrong. Not just uncomfortable. Wrong. She had worked at the branch long enough to recognize high net worth account indicators, executive service markers, and restricted client classifications. A few seconds earlier, she had caught a glimpse of information on Heather's screen before it disappeared. The image had flashed by quickly, but not quickly enough. Emily knew what she had seen. She looked toward Naomi again. The woman remained calm. Almost impossibly calm. Most customers would have demanded a supervisor by now. Some would have left. Others would have raised their voices. Naomi did none of those things. She simply stood there while her identification card remained on the marble floor between her and the people judging her. Emily felt a knot form in her stomach. Richard Monroe was speaking again. "Until we complete additional verification, we cannot move forward." His voice carried the confidence of someone who believed the matter was settled. Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Additional verification for what?" Richard smiled politely. "For your protection and ours." Heather nodded immediately. "Exactly." The answer sounded rehearsed. Naomi noticed. "So did several customers nearby?" A man seated near the wealth management offices folded his newspaper completely and watched openly now. Two women waiting for appointments exchanged looks. The lobby was no longer pretending not to pay attention. Emily glanced toward her computer, then back toward Naomi, then toward Richard. Finally she stood. This time she walked closer. "Mr. Monroe," she said carefully. Richard's expression tightened. "What is it, Emily?" She hesitated for only a moment. "I think there may be information you should review again." The lobby became very quiet. Heather's eyes narrowed immediately. Richard looked annoyed rather than curious. "I have already reviewed the account." Emily swallowed. "I understand, sir. But I think there may be." Richard interrupted her. "Return to your desk." His tone was sharper now. Emily stopped speaking, but she did not move. Naomi watched the exchange closely. Richard's reaction had answered a question nobody asked aloud. He was no longer interested in finding out whether they were right. He was interested in proving they were right. Heather folded her arms. "Everything has been handled appropriately." Emily looked directly at her. "Has it?" The single question landed harder than she intended. Heather's face flushed. Richard stepped forward. "Emily, that will be enough." Slowly, reluctantly, Emily returned toward her workstation. But she kept looking back. The doubt remained visible on her face. Naomi noticed something else as well. Other employees had started paying attention. One banker stopped typing. Another employee glanced toward the teller station twice within 30 seconds. The story Richard and Heather were telling was beginning to crack under its own weight. People sensed it. Nobody had the full picture yet, but certainty was fading. Naomi looked toward Emily briefly. Their eyes met for less than a second. It was enough. Emily had not solved anything. She had not exposed anything. But she had become the first person in the building willing to question what everyone else was accepting. Richard adjusted his jacket and attempted to regain control of the room. Heather straightened her keyboard and stared at her monitor. Yet the atmosphere had changed. The branch still looked polished and professional from the outside. Inside, doubt had entered the room. And once doubt appears, the truth rarely stays hidden for long. The tension that had been building quietly throughout the morning finally found a new target. Richard Monroe looked at Naomi for a long moment, then turned toward Heather. A silent exchange passed between them. Whatever hesitation had existed before was gone now. Richard reached toward the keyboard and reviewed the account information once more. His jaw tightened. Then he made a decision. "Place a temporary hold on the transaction," he said. Heather did not hesitate. Her fingers moved across the keyboard. A few keystrokes echoed through the silence. Naomi watched without reacting. Around them, the atmosphere changed again. The hold was not just a delay. It was a statement. Richard folded his arms. Until further review, we are unable to proceed. Naomi tilted her head slightly. Based on what? Richard answered immediately. Risk assessment. The phrase sounded official. It also sounded empty. Heather printed several pages from the system and slid them across the counter with unnecessary force. The papers spread unevenly across the polished surface. One sheet slipped off the edge and drifted toward the floor. Another followed. Then another. The white pages scattered across the marble near Naomi's feet. Several customers looked up sharply. The movement drew attention from across the lobby. Heather did not apologize. Richard did not correct her. Naomi stared at the documents resting on the floor. For a brief moment, the bright banking lobby faded from view. Another room appeared in its place. Another building. Another year. 19-year-old Naomi sat in a narrow office wearing the only business outfit she could afford. She remembered the interview clearly. She remembered answering every question carefully. She remembered the hiring manager barely looking at her resume before setting it aside. Then came the final moment. The folder containing her application had been pushed away without interest. Dismissed before she had ever been considered. She remembered walking out into the summer heat feeling invisible. Not because she lacked talent. Because someone had already decided who she was. The memory disappeared as quickly as it came. Naomi returned to the present. The marble floor. The scattered papers. The silent crowd. The same assumption. Different decade. Different building. Same story. Except this time she was not 19. Richard tapped the counter. Do you have anything further to add? Naomi looked at him calmly. Quite a bit. Heather laughed softly. Then maybe now would be a good time. Emily Dawson watched from across the lobby. Her concern had become obvious. She knew something was deeply wrong. Several other employees looked uncomfortable as well. Even customers who knew nothing about the situation could sense that professionalism had left the room. Naomi slowly bent down and gathered the papers herself. Not because she had to. Because nobody else would. She stacked them neatly and placed them back on the counter. Her movements remained controlled. Deliberate. Calm. That calmness unsettled Richard more with every passing minute. He expected anger. He expected frustration. Instead, he received patience. And patience can be dangerous when it belongs to someone holding information nobody else possesses. Across the country, conference calls continued. Attorneys reviewed final documents. Executives waited for instructions. Timelines remained active. Decisions remained pending. In Charlotte, however, Richard and Heather believed they were controlling the situation. They had no idea that every choice they were making was moving them closer to a consequence neither of them could yet see. Richard Monroe believed the situation was under control. That was the dangerous part. Confidence built on false assumptions often survives longer than it should. He glanced around the lobby and seemed reassured by the fact that nobody was openly challenging him anymore. Heather appeared equally satisfied. The transaction was frozen. The customer was contained. The story, in their minds, was finished. Naomi Carter knew it had barely begun. She reached into her coat pocket and removed her phone. The movement immediately caught Heather's attention. If you are calling someone to complain, you are welcome to do that, Heather said. The decision stands. Naomi looked at the screen for a moment. Then she pressed a single contact. The call connected almost instantly. Angela. Her voice remained calm. On the other end, Angela Price answered without hesitation. Good morning, Naomi. We are ready whenever you are. Naomi glanced across the lobby. Richard was pretending not to listen. Heather was failing to pretend. Several customers were openly watching now. Even employees had stopped hiding their curiosity. Delay the signature, Naomi said. Silence followed. Not in the bank. On the call. A very specific kind of silence. The kind that appears when experienced professionals understand the weight of a decision. Angela answered carefully. Are you certain? Naomi looked toward Richard. Yes. Another pause. Then Angela spoke. Understood. I will notify legal, finance, and the executive teams immediately. The call ended. Naomi placed the phone back into her pocket. Nothing about her expression changed. Yet somewhere far beyond Charlotte, entire schedules began shifting. In Manhattan, attorneys reviewing final merger documents received updated instructions. In Chicago, Analysts waiting for authorization paused implementation plans. In Atlanta, executive assistants canceled a series of confirmation calls. Board members who had spent months preparing for a historic transaction suddenly found themselves waiting. Questions started appearing before answers existed. Back inside the branch, none of that activity was visible. The lobby looked exactly the same. Marble floors, quiet conversations, soft lighting, wealth management brochures neatly arranged on polished tables. Yet an invisible clock had started counting down. Emily Dawson watched Naomi carefully. She had no idea what the phone call meant, but she knew it mattered. Something about Angela's name had triggered recognition. Emily had seen it before. Not in person. In corporate communications. Executive correspondence. Strategic announcements. Her pulse quickened. Across the room, Richard folded his arms. "Have we reached an understanding?" he asked. Naomi looked at him. "Not yet." Heather shook her head. "There is nothing more to discuss." Naomi almost smiled. Almost. The teller thought this was about a transaction. Richard thought this was about authority. Both were wrong. This was about judgment. Every minute they spent defending their decisions revealed more than any background check ever could. A customer near the investment offices quietly stood and moved closer. Another customer stopped pretending to read financial paperwork. The room felt different now, like people were waiting for something they could not yet define. Naomi glanced briefly toward the floor where her identification had remained for most of the morning. Then she looked back at Richard. The branch manager held her gaze confidently. He still believed he was evaluating her. He still believed he controlled the outcome. What he did not realize was that somewhere across the country, a $5.9 billion future had just been placed on hold because of choices made inside a single bank branch on an ordinary Tuesday morning. The first crack appeared where nobody expected it. Emily Dawson was staring at her monitor again. This time she was not looking for confirmation. She was looking for courage. Her hands hovered above the keyboard. Her heart was moving faster than it should have been for an ordinary Tuesday morning. Because nothing about the morning felt ordinary anymore. The information on her screen refused to match the narrative unfolding in front of her. She checked the profile again. Then again. Executive restrictions. Priority clearance. Strategic review designation. Internal references that did not belong to an average customer account. Emily's eyes widened. Across the lobby, Naomi Carter stood exactly where she had been standing for nearly 20 minutes. Calm, patient, unmoved. Richard Monroe noticed Emily's expression immediately. "Emily," he called. "Step away from that terminal." Several heads turned. Emily swallowed. For a moment, she looked like she might obey. Then she looked at Naomi. Something shifted. "Sir," she said carefully, "I think you need to see this." Richard's face hardened. "I said step away from the terminal." The room became silent again. Not the comfortable silence of a bank. The uneasy silence of people realizing they were witnessing something important. Heather crossed her arms. "This is getting ridiculous." Emily took a breath. "No," she said quietly. "I think what is happening here is ridiculous." Richard walked toward her station. Too late. Emily turned the monitor slightly. The movement lasted less than 2 seconds. But it was enough. Enough for several employees nearby to see. Enough for Heather to notice the color leave Richard's face. Enough for doubt to become certainty. Richard immediately reached for the screen and turned it back. "That information is confidential." His voice sounded different now. Less confident. More urgent. Naomi watched without speaking. Heather looked from Richard to Emily and back again. "What is going on?" she asked. Nobody answered. Richard adjusted his tie for the third time in 5 minutes. His hands were no longer steady. Emily looked directly at him. "You should have reviewed the entire profile." Richard did not respond. Naomi finally moved. Not dramatically, just one step forward. The movement drew every eye in the room. She looked down briefly at the identification card that had started everything. Then she looked at Heather. "You threw my identification onto the floor." Heather opened her mouth, but no words appeared. Naomi's voice remained calm. "You decided who I was before you knew my name." The lobby seemed to hold its breath. Richard stared at the floor. Emily stared at Naomi. Customers stared at everyone. Naomi continued. "This morning your institution asked for my approval on a $5.9 billion merger." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the sounds of the branch seemed to disappear. Heather blinked twice. "What?" she whispered. Naomi did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The signature that was scheduled for today belonged to me. Richard's face lost what little color remained. A customer near the investment offices slowly lowered his coffee cup. Another employee stepped back from her desk. Emily closed her eyes briefly because the truth she suspected had finally arrived. Naomi looked at Richard. You thought you were evaluating a customer. Another second passed. You were evaluating yourselves. The silence that followed felt endless. And for the first time that morning, Richard Monroe appeared to understand the size of the mistake standing directly in front of him. The collapse did not happen with shouting. It happened with ringing phones. Richard Monroe's cell phone vibrated first. He looked down at the screen and immediately looked away. Then it rang again and again. Heather's computer flashed with incoming messages. Notifications appeared faster than she could read them. Across the branch, employees began checking their own screens. Something was moving through the system. Fast. Naomi Carter remained perfectly still. The center of the storm always looks calm. Richard finally answered the call. Richard Monroe speaking. Whatever he heard caused the muscles in his face to tighten instantly. Yes, sir. A pause. No, sir. Another pause. I understand. The call ended. Before he could lower the phone, it rang again. Heather watched him nervously. What is happening? She asked. Richard did not answer. For the first time all morning, he seemed unsure how to answer anything. Naomi looked toward the windows overlooking downtown Charlotte. Sunlight reflected from nearby office towers. Traffic continued moving below. The city looked unchanged. Yet inside boardrooms across the country, plans were unraveling. In Manhattan, legal teams had suspended final documentation. In Chicago, analysts had halted integration schedules. In Atlanta, executive calendars that had been coordinated for months were suddenly empty. The merger that everyone expected to celebrate had entered emergency review. Questions were being asked. Names were being checked. Reports were being requested. The consequences had begun traveling backward toward the source. Back toward one branch manager. One teller. One decision. Heather's confidence disappeared one piece at a time. Richard, she said quietly. Tell me what is going on. Richard looked at her. Then away. His silence was answer enough. Across the lobby, customers exchanged whispers. Employees stood frozen at their stations. Emily Dawson remained near her desk, watching events unfold with a mixture of relief and disbelief. She had suspected something important. She had never imagined something this large. Another phone rang. Then another. The branch suddenly sounded different. Not busy. Fragile. Richard's office line lit up. A wealth advisor received a message and stared at the screen. Someone from corporate compliance appeared on a video call request. The institution itself seemed to be waking up to what had happened. Naomi finally spoke. Her voice remained even. I gave every opportunity for someone to correct this. Nobody challenged her. Nobody could. Heather stared at the marble floor where the identification card had rested for most of the morning. The memory of that moment now seemed impossible to escape. One careless act. One assumption. One choice. Richard lowered himself slowly into a chair behind the service desk. The movement looked less like sitting and more like surrendering to reality. The customers noticed. The employees noticed. Everyone noticed. The authority that had dominated the room earlier was gone. Naomi did not celebrate. She did not smile. She did not enjoy watching people fail. That was never the point. The point was simpler. Character reveals itself when nobody important appears to be watching. Richard and Heather had revealed theirs. Now the consequences were revealing themselves in return. And as the calls continued to arrive from executives, attorneys, and compliance officers, one truth became impossible to ignore. The greatest damage that morning had not been done to Naomi Carter. It had been done by the people who believed they had the power to decide her worth. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The phones had stopped ringing. The explanations had run out. The confidence that once filled the branch had drained away, leaving only silence behind. Naomi Carter looked around the lobby one final time. The marble floors were the same. The glass walls were the same. The polished counters and carefully arranged displays had not changed. Yet the room felt completely different from the one she had entered earlier that morning. Richard Monroe sat quietly behind the service desk, staring at nothing in particular. Heather Collins looked down at her workstation, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Around them, employees stood frozen between embarrassment and realization. Customers watched without speaking. The truth had settled over the room like a weight nobody could ignore. Naomi stepped toward the counter and reached down. She picked up her identification card herself. The simple motion seemed to affect the room more than any speech could have. Earlier, nobody had bothered to do it. Now everyone understood why that mattered. Naomi slid the card into her pocket and looked toward Emily Dawson. The young employee straightened slightly. "Thank you for speaking up," Naomi said. Emily blinked in surprise. "I just thought someone should." Naomi nodded once. "That is usually how change starts." Emily smiled faintly. It was the first genuine expression of relief anyone had shown all morning. Richard finally stood. The movement was slow, careful, like someone carrying the weight of a mistake he could no longer deny. "Ms. Carter," he began. The words sounded unfamiliar in his mouth. "I owe you an apology." Naomi listened. Richard swallowed. What happened here should not have happened. Naomi considered him for a moment. Then she nodded. No, it should not have. There was no anger in her voice. That somehow made the moment more powerful. Heather looked up. Her confidence was gone now. In its place sat something far more uncomfortable. Reflection. Naomi turned toward her. "The problem was never that you did not know who I was." Heather said nothing. Naomi continued. "The problem was how quickly you decided who I could not be." Nobody in the lobby missed the meaning of those words. Several customers lowered their eyes. Others nodded quietly. The lesson reached far beyond a single teller station. Naomi glanced toward the windows overlooking the city. Charlotte's skyline shined beneath the late morning sun. Somewhere beyond those buildings, executives were still waiting for updates. Attorneys were still reviewing options. Board members were still discussing the future. But that was not what mattered most to her at that moment. She turned back toward the room. "I did not delay a decision because my feelings were hurt," she said calmly. "I delayed it because character matters." The branch remained silent. Naomi adjusted her coat and began walking toward the exit. Her footsteps echoed softly across the marble floor. Halfway to the doors, she stopped and looked back one final time. "I never raised my voice today," she said. "I raised the standard." Then she continued walking. The glass doors opened. Sunlight spilled across the entrance. And as Naomi Carter stepped into the busy streets of Charlotte, she left behind something far larger than a frozen transaction or a suspended merger. She left behind a room full of people forced to confront a simple truth. Respect should never depend on appearance. Dignity should never require proof. And the moment someone decides another person's worth based on assumptions, they reveal far more about themselves than the person standing in front of them.